we're constantly surrounded by broadcast media, right?
Yeah.
TV news, radio, streaming. It's just everywhere.
Absolutely. It's easy to forget there's a whole system making it work.
And well, right at the center, kind of overseeing things, is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not something you think about every single day, but their impact is actually pretty huge on the information we all get.
It really is. Think about the airwaves themselves. They're seen as this valuable public resource.
Okay.
And back in 1934, the Communications Act basically set the ground rules. If you want to use these public airwaves for broadcasting, well, you need a license from the FCC.
Right, a license.
But it's not just a piece of paper. It comes with this really big condition.
Yeah.
You have to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity.
That phrase, I feel like that's key.
Oh, it is. It sounds simple, maybe a bit vague, but it's actually, quite loaded.
Yeah.
And it's right at the heart of what we're digging into today.
Yeah, because you, our listener, sent us this fascinating batch of sources. We've got news reports from Politico, Fox News, Truth Out.
A real mix.
Totally. Plus a discussion thread from Reddit, some analysis from the Brookings Institution, an MSNBC transcript, and even this helpful FAQ from the Congressional Research Service on the FCC and media freedom.
It's a great collection because it covers so many angles. You've got the immediate political stuff, the legal interpretation.
Exactly, all swirling around these recent statements, actions involving the FCC broadcast licenses, specifically former President Trump and CBS's 60 Minutes.
And that mix, that range of perspectives is really what we need to understand, the complexities here. You see the clash between political rhetoric and First Amendment principles.
Right. So you shared these because you're curious. What does this all mean for the news we watch? What about the future of media? So let's try and unpack it all.
Let's do it.
First off, former President Trump, he hasn't exactly been quiet about CBS and 60 Minutes, has he?
No, definitely not quiet. According to these sources, particularly his posts on social media that Fox News and that Reddit thread detail, he really didn't hold back after a couple of recent segments on 60 Minutes.
Which ones were they, Ben?
Well, one was Scott Pelley's interview with Ukrainian President Zelensky.
Ah, yeah.
Where, Trump's past comments about Ukraine starting the war or calling Zelensky a dictator, those were directly brought up and challenged.
Okay, I remember that one. And the other?
The other segment revisited his let's say, reported interest back in the day about the U.S. potentially acquiring Greenland.
Right, Greenland. Okay. So these reports clearly hit a nerve.
Seems like it. He called CBS out of control on social media. And he publicly called on the FCC chair at the time, Brendan Carr, to impose, and I quote, maximum fines and punishment.
Wow. Maximum punishment.
And even went so far as to suggest CBS should lose their license for what he described as unlawful and illegal behavior.
Lose their license. That's a serious threat. The Reddit thread must have gone wild.
Oh, it did. Lots of discussion there, obviously. Many people voicing serious concerns about what that kind of statement means for press freedom.
Yeah.
The chilling effect.
And it wasn't just words, was it? Fox News mentioned he's also pursuing a lawsuit, a big one.
A very big one. Against CBS and its parent company, Paramount Global. Initially, I think the figure floating around was maybe $10 billion.
Which is already huge.
Exactly. But now reports say that figure has been bumped up to $20 billion.
$20 billion? For what?
The lawsuit claims election interference. It relates to that 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris before the 2024 election.
Okay.
Trump's argument is that CBS edited her answers deceptively in a way that hurt him politically.
The Brookings analysis we looked at pointed out how unusual this is, right? A former president suing a media company, his administration, technically had regulatory power over.
That's definitely an interesting dynamic.
But this kind of criticism of the media from him, it feels familiar, doesn't it? I mean, Truth Out and other sources reminded us of his past comments about NBC, ABC.
Oh, absolutely. His use of terms like fake news or enemy of the people.
Right.
This isn't new territory. He's consistently used very strong language against news outlets when he disagrees with their coverage. Truth Out specifically noted this pattern, suggesting licenses should be pulled for negative reporting, sometimes even mentioning legal action against reporters.
Okay, so that's the context from the former president. Very public criticism, lawsuits. Now, let's pivot to the FCC itself. What's their actual role here? How much power do they really have?
Yeah, that's the crucial question. The Congressional Research Service FAQ is really useful here. The FCC, set up by that 1934 Act, is technically an independent agency.
Independent.
They oversee communications in the U.S., radio, TV, broadcast stuff.
Yeah.
And a huge part of their job is granting those licenses we talked about, the permission slips to use the public airwaves.
And those licenses depend on serving the public interest.
Convenience and necessity.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the standard. But it's also worth remembering, while they're independent, the president appoints the chair and commissioners, and the Senate confirms them. So there's always, a political connection.
So having the power to grant these really valuable licenses, that sounds like significant leverage. Could they just, pull a license if they didn't like a news report?
Well, that's where it gets complicated. You have the First Amendment, right?
Yeah.
Freedom of speech, and Section 326 of the Communications Act itself.
What does that section say?
It explicitly forbids the FCC from censoring broadcast material. It prevents them from interfering with free expression.
Ah, okay.
The FCC itself has generally said that the public interest is, quote, best served by permitting free expression of views. Politico's reporting highlighted this, mentioning past statements from current chair Jessica Rosenworcel, too. They've historically been very wary of stepping into news distortion claims because of these massive First Amendment hurdles.
So they control the who gets to broadcast, but the what is largely protected.
That's a good way to put it. They grant, renew, and yes, technically can revoke licenses, but only under very specific, usually technical or ownership-related circumstances, using that power purely based on news content. That's legally very, very tricky territory.
The Brookings analysis seemed to emphasize that reluctance, didn't it? Quoting Rosenworcel saying the FCC shouldn't be the president's speech police.
Exactly. Now, the vagueness of that public interest standard has always been a point of debate. Some worry it's a potential loophole for political pressure.
While others see it as needed flexibility.
Right, it's a long-standing tension.
What about the fairness doctrine? I feel like that comes up sometimes. Did that give them more control over content back in the day?
The fairness doctrine. Good question. The CRS explainer covers this. It was a policy, that required broadcasters to cover controversial public issues and, importantly, to air contrasting viewpoints.
So ensuring balance? Kind of?
Kind of. The rationale was partly tied to the idea that airwaves were scarce, a limited resource, so broadcasters had this extra duty. But it was phase out, mostly repealed in 1987, fully gone by 2000.
Why did they get rid of it?
Mostly because the media landscape just exploded, right? Cable TV, then the internet. The whole limited resource argument got much weaker. Plus, there were always those nagging First Amendment concerns about compelling speech. So no, the fairness doctrine isn't really a tool in the FCC's toolbox anymore.
Interesting how technology changes the regulations, too. Okay, now let's talk about Brendan Carr. Former President Trump has signaled he'd be his choice for the next FCC chair. What do the sources tell us about his views on all this?
Well, the picture painted, especially by Politico and Brookings, suggests his views often align with Trump's criticisms. They point to his past public statements hitting CBS and NBC pretty hard.
Like what?
He's used phrases like, broadcast licenses are not sacred cows. Strong stuff. And it was noted he worked with the Trump transition team before, trying to understand their agenda for the agency.
And hasn't he already taken some action related to this? Brookings mentioned him reopening an FCC investigation.
Yes, that's a really significant point. He reopened an investigation into that CBS interview with Kamala Harris, one that the FCC had previously dismissed.
Okay. And the significance?
He explicitly linked it to Paramount Global's potential sale of CBS. He stated the findings from this reopened investigation could be a factor when the FCC reviews that big business deal.
Wow. So connecting a content complaint directly to a major corporate transaction that needs FCC approval.
Exactly. That definitely raised some eyebrows, concerns about politics influencing regulatory decisions with huge financial stakes.
But didn't the Brookings piece also mention Carr saying something different back in 2021, something about newsroom independence?
It did. That's the potentially contradictory part.
Yeah.
He had previously stated, apparently, that newsroom editorial decisions should be beyond government reach, shouldn't be targeted by government action.
So how do we square that?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? His more recent statements and actions, especially regarding CBS and the Paramount deal, suggest maybe a shift in approach or perhaps a different interpretation of that public interest standard now that he's in line for the chair position. Or maybe he sees different contexts requiring different approaches. It's hard to say for sure.
And he also floated the idea of formally defining that public interest standard, right? Brookings mentioned that too.
That's right. He suggested starting a formal rulemaking process to actually write down a specific definition of public interest for broadcast licenses.
Which sounds Potentially helpful. Clarity is good, right?
On the surface, maybe.
Yeah.
But Brookings raises the concern that, given the political environment, trying to nail down such a broad, inherently subjective standard could actually create a tool for political leverage. Who gets to define public interest? And based on what criteria? It could become quite contentious.
Okay, this is clearly stirring up a lot of reaction. What are the main worries and criticisms popping up in these sources?
The big one, echoed across Politico, Truthout, the CRS report, is the threat to the First Amendment. The fear is that these statements and actions can turn the FCC into, well, a political weapon.
Leading to that chilling effect we mentioned.
Precisely. The concern is that news organizations might start to self-censor. They might shy away from tough investigative reporting on powerful people or government actions because they fear retaliation, losing their license, facing investigations, that sort of thing. And historically, even just the threat of government action can cause that.
That MSNBC transcript with Stephen Cook really hammered that point home, didn't it? Comparing it to tactics in other countries.
It did. He drew direct parallels to how authoritarian regimes control the media narrative. They intimidate critical journalists, silence dissent, and make sure only the official story gets out.
And the worry is using the FCC for that.
The worry is that using the state's regulatory power to punish media outlets for critical reporting is a hallmark of those regimes. Exploiting the vagueness of the public interest standard, as Brookings noted, could be the way to exert that kind of arbitrary power and really undermine press independence, which, is essential for democracy.
It's interesting you mentioned potential legislative action earlier. It sounds like some in Congress are trying to push back against these concerns. Tell us about this Broadcast Freedom and Independence Act.
Right. This bill, pushed by Senators Lujan, Rosen, and Markey, based on their press releases and mentioned by the CRS, aims directly at reinforcing the FCC's independence.
How would it do that?
Its main goal is to explicitly forbid the FCC from taking punitive actions against broadcasters, like denying license renewals or blocking mergers, specifically based on the viewpoints expressed in their programming.
So basically building a legal wall against viewpoint discrimination by the FCC.
That's the idea. But the bill is careful to say it wouldn't touch the FCC's existing authority over things like obscenity, lottery info, fraud, or actual incitement to violence. Those are already established areas of regulation.
And it has support.
Yeah, groups like the ACLU, Public Knowledge, Free Press Action, they're backing it. It shows there's pretty broad concern out there about protecting broadcast content from political interference.
We also saw in the Brookings piece that Trump's legal fights weren't just with CBS, were they?
No, that's right. Besides the big CBS Paramount suit, Brookings mentioned reported settlements in other cases. One with Disney ABC over a comment related to the E. Jean Carroll case.
Okay.
And another with Meta, Facebook's parent company, about being deplatformed after January 6th.
So these are separate lawsuits outside the FCC's direct lane.
Correct.
Yeah.
But their existence, and particularly the reported settlement talks with Paramount, raises questions. Brookings pointed out the concern that settlements could look like major concessions, potentially appeasement, and might even carry legal risks for company executives. It hints at a possible pattern of media companies maybe trying to avoid prolonged conflict.
And what was that other angle, the news distortion rule, mentioned in the conservative group's complaint? How does that fit in?
Yes, the Center for American Rights. Brookings explained they filed a formal complaint with the FCC about that Harris interview on CBS, alleging deliberate news distortion.
Arguing it violated the public interest standard.
Exactly. Now, interestingly then, Commissioner Carr had actually said publicly that the FCC's news distortion rule is super narrow, almost never used because the First Amendment protects news content so strongly. But his later decision, as the incoming chair designate, to reopen content complaints like this one, well, it suggests he might be willing to look more closely at these kinds of complaints now, despite those earlier statements about the rule's narrowness.
It really does feel like this constant back and forth, this tension between the FCC's job to manage the airwaves for the public and the absolute necessity of a free press under the First Amendment.
That's the core of it. And understanding that balance means looking at the legal foundations, like those Supreme Court cases Brookings briefly mentioned.
Like the Pentagon Papers case.
Exactly. New York Times v. United States. It set a really high bar for the government trying to censor the press beforehand. Then you have Miami Herald v. Tornillo, which said the government can't force a newspaper to publish something it doesn't want to, even for fairness.
Okay.
And FCC v. League of Women Voters protected public broadcasters' rights to editorialize. These cases basically drew lines in the sand about government control over media content.
So, putting it all together, We have the FCC with this mandate for the public interest. We have the First Amendment providing really strong protection for press freedom, limiting government interference.
Right, delicate balance.
And now we're seeing significant political pressure entering the mix, calls for punishment, lawsuits, reopened investigations. It raises real questions about whether that balance is being threatened.
That's precisely the situation. Our sources show these different takes. Is this legitimate oversight or is it political intimidation? It really comes down to how you interpret that public interest standard and whether it's being used fairly or as a tool to pressure critical voices. Hopefully this deep dive has given everyone listening a clearer sense of the forces involved and the arguments being made.
It definitely clarifies the stakes. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? You know, considering this whole history of media regulation, the strong free speech protections, what is the best way forward? How do we ensure broadcasters are accountable, but also keep the press truly independent?
Is it new laws, like that Broadcast Freedom Act?
Or is it more about public awareness, people paying attention to this, or maybe even the media outlets themselves reinforcing their own ethical standards?
It's complex. There are no easy answers.
Definitely not. It's certainly something to keep thinking about, especially as you're consuming news and considering where your information comes from and, well, how protected that process really is.